Good morning, everyone. Hello, wherever you are. Happy Friday. Just give us a few moments as there are people just coming into the room. I'm so glad that you're here. We'll begin in just a few minutes. Excellent. So welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Fall 2025 webinar series, bringing ethics into the conversation. Welcome to today's session. I'm Azita Hirsa, a senior lecturer in the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I teach some of my favorite topics: management of engineering and technology, engineering ethics, ethics of modeling, and professional development. I also host the Leaders in Action conversations at RPI, and am the past chair of the American Society of Engineering Education's Ethics Division, and have proudly hosted the Online Ethics Center webinars since 2023. The Online Ethics Center, hosted by the University of Virginia, is a comprehensive digital repository dedicated to ethics education in engineering and science. Beyond providing valuable teaching and learning resources, the OEC cultivates a vibrant community of faculty, students, researchers, and professionals engaged in meaningful discussions on ethical issues. Check out our resources at onlineethics.org. Our webinar series explores engineering and science to ethics within the interconnected realms of industry, government, and academia, the triple helix shaping technological and ethical advancements. It is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Joseph L. Badaracco, Jr., the John Shad Professor of Business Ethics at Harvard Business School. Professor Badaracco is a deeply respected authority in the fields of leadership, decision-making, and ethics. Over his long career, he has taught courses in business ethics, strategy, and general management in both the MBA and the executive programs at Harvard. He holds a broad and rigorous academic foundation. He earned his undergraduate degree at St. Louis University, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and then returned to Harvard Business School to complete both his MBA and DBA. Throughout his career, Professor Badaracco has published numerous influential works that explore the complexity of moral dilemmas in leadership. Some of my favorites: Defining Moments When Managers Must Choose Between Right and Right, Leading Quietly, An Unorthodox Guide to Doing the Right Thing, Questions of Character, Illuminating the Heart of Leadership Through Literature, and Managing in the Gray, 5 Timeless Questions for Resolving Your Toughest Problems at Work. And if you haven't had a chance to get these books or take a look at them, you must. They are just awesome. He's particularly known for his insights into how leaders navigate morally ambiguous situations, not merely when right and wrong are clear, but when multiple legitimate responsibilities conflict and judgment matters. Beyond his writing and teaching, Professor Badaracco has served in important roles at Harvard as chair of the MBA program, as a member of the Harvard University's Advisory Committee on Shareholder Responsibility, and as housemaster of Currier House at Harvard College. He has also been a key figure at Harvard's international executive education efforts, including serving as faculty chair of the Nomura School of Advanced Management in Tokyo. In sum, Professor Badaracco combines deep scholarship, real-world sensibility, and an abiding commitment to helping leaders ask the right questions in thorny ethical terrain. It is a privilege to have him with us today. After Dr. Badaracco's talk, we will take questions. Now, we're going to do this session a little differently. So Dr. Badaracco will stop at a halfway point, about 20 minutes. So if you have any questions during his first 20 minutes, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I will read it to him. And then once we've answered those questions, we'll go back and he will continue with his talk. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. Please join me in welcoming Professor Badaracco. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
I'm very happy to be here, Rosita. Thanks for the great introduction. Thanks to Tracy for making sure that the webinar is actually working, and it's worked out really well so far. Let me explain, and I also want to thank you, Rosita, for promoting my books. That's terrific, and I'll provide the Amazon links later on at the end of the session. So to turn to what we'll be doing today, I've really, as Ida and I talked about, two interesting topics that I've worked on recently, and I'm going to try to spend a little time on both of them. So that's why the format is I'll talk now for 15 or 20 minutes, take some questions, and then turn to the second topic. So the first topic is actually a departure from what I've studied and written about for many years. That's been individual decision making. In other words, if you're in a position of responsibility, you've got a hard problem, a right versus right dilemma, how do you think about that? Another important issue in the business ethics domain, as I'm sure you all understand, is the question of the social responsibility of business. And I've taught about that. I've got colleagues who've studied it, and I've had some ideas percolating, and I published an article about this with what I thought were some interesting ideas a couple of years ago. And now I'm in the process of making it into a little book. So that's what I want to talk about right now. The working title of the book is Who Guards the Guardians? And some of you might recognize that. I will come back and explain it in just a little bit. It's basically an ancient Roman question about power in a society. And as background for this book, I continue to think about a case study that I've taught here on Facebook. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with Facebook. And we start the discussion by asking, what is Facebook? And then I go to a board and I write down answers. And by the time we're finished, I have something like 15 or 20 answers there. You can imagine what some of them are. So it's a digital town square. It's a publisher. It's an advertising company. It's a coping mechanism for people. It's our digital overlord. It goes on and on from there. Critics, people who like Facebook, everybody has a different characterization of what this is. And the reason I keep coming back to Facebook is I think it's a dramatic, maybe exaggerated example of a phenomenon that we're just beginning to recognize. And that is that corporations are becoming one of, if not the central social institutions of society. We all see them as central economic institutions. So the key word in that idea is corporations are becoming the central social institutions in society. And this raises a number of questions. So for the men and women who are running these corporations, what are their responsibilities? And that, of course, is an old question. Okay. The next two are a little more interesting. What obligations should society impose on these new entities, which are in many fundamental ways social and political rather than primarily economic? And the third question, I think, is the most interesting and challenging one. Can governments actually do that effectively? In other words, have corporations become so powerful, so pervasive, so adept at moving quickly, so adept at shaping their environment, that it's going to be very hard for government to do what government did over the course of the last century, since the rise of the huge industrial firms, and that is impose obligations and enforce those obligations on companies. And so that question, what can society do if it takes the social role of corporations seriously? That's what lies behind the title, Who Guards the Guardians? The Romans asked this question because the emperor, to protect himself, created what was called the Praetorian Guard. And the guard became very powerful. In fact, It became so powerful that at times it heavily influenced the choice of an emperor and the behavior of the emperor. So the Praetorian Guard were supposed to be the guardians, but the question was, who guards them? Who puts limits on what they can do, and who makes sure that these limits are actually imposed? And that's the question I'm asking about what you might call the new guardians. And these are the executives who run these extraordinary corporations that basically dominate and shape not just our economic world, but the whole society around us. I also am toying with another idea as I think about the power of the new guardians. And that is that they sometimes exercise their power in direct, familiar ways. They lobby for things, they block things. They can now, in the US at least, influence elections in various ways. But if you accept the view that they are pervasive and that their influence is almost everywhere, they may operate in a second way. They may exercise power in a second way. And that is almost like gravity, which is a constant, pervasive, largely invisible force, but it bends and shapes things in certain directions. And the other thing I would add is a quick reference to artificial intelligence. You know, we could have a great discussion, and I'm sure many of you would have interesting views on questions like how will it evolve over the next few years? How valuable is it now? When will corporations start using it more? So forth. My own sense from limited study and from my own use of it is that it's here to stay. It's going to get more sophisticated, and that corporations that are already enormously powerful are going to be able to use AI to amplify their power even further. In some ways, their power over us as individuals and citizens, and their power to shape what governments do. That's another question. It's a speculative question, but it's another version of this question: who is going to guard these guardians? And can we guard these guardians? Now, how did we get in this situation where arguably, and at least as I see things, corporations have become the central institutions of society? And I will point to four developments over the last 50 years. They're sort of, as I see it, creeping, quiet, background, radicalizing forces. The first one is what I'm tentatively calling the Great Delegation. And basically, what society and government, at least in the US, have done in the last half century is delegated a lot of very important social tasks to corporations. So, fair employment, fair wages, clean environment, safe workplaces. These aren't economic objectives. These are important social objectives that we all care about. Legislation has been passed, regulations have been developed, and corporations are now responsible for a vast range of important social tasks. This wasn't true of US Steel. It wasn't true of the early General Motors. It wasn't true of the early big banks. It's true of virtually all corporations now. The second trend that I think has developed might have happened on its own, but it's developed partly in response to what I've called the Great Delegation. And I call it sophisticated corporate statecraft. And this is the phenomenon of corporations getting ever more adept, ever more sophisticated at influencing government policy, regulation, as well as the social context in which policy is developed and regulations are promulgated. And, it's interesting, if you look at the big tech companies, they had almost no presence in Washington, D.C. 25 years ago. They were entrepreneurs struggling against companies that had a lot of influence in Washington. And now these tech companies are among the biggest and most effective lobbyists there. So that's the second phenomenon. I will point to it, not describe it any further, but the extreme sophistication that a lot of companies have developed at shaping government policy. The third one I won't spend much time on because I think you're all familiar with it, maybe intimately. And that's what I would call sort of ubiquitous information technology. In other words, IT is fundamentally everywhere. Uh, I did a little background reading for this, and I'm probably going to refer to a somewhat obscure Jesuit paleontologist named Teilhard de Chardin. He was French. He lived in the early part of the last century. And in addition to paleontology, for reasons that nobody really understands, he had an insight into how technology might develop. And he imagined something very much like our internet today, sort of a global human brain. He called it the noosphere. Noos is a Greek word for mind, the noosphere. And in many respects, that is the world that we are living in, the one that Desjardins anticipated, one that would have been unimaginable just 30 years ago, and it's now our everyday experience. If you want to think about how unimaginable this world is, imagine that somebody had found, in New York City somewhere, an iPhone, okay, like, this nice little iPhone here, okay? Um, and it worked. I mean, I understand the networks didn't exist, but it worked. What would have happened after that? I think government security agencies would have seized the phone because it had technology far more advanced than anything they had. And I think a lot of us would start believing that aliens must have visited the Earth and left one of these behind because of these unimaginable technologies. Today, they are routine, and AI, either quickly or slowly, is going to intensify this impact. And the final thing I will mention is what I would call the second managerial revolution. The first managerial revolution occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It led to the creation and management of huge industrial firms with huge manufacturing plants. Probably the most famous one is the Ford Motor River Rouge plant, which is the biggest manufacturing plant that had ever been seen everywhere in the world. Okay. And a very important business historian, Alfred Chandler, probably the most important business historian of the last century, wrote a book called The Visible Hand. He was contrasting the visible hand of management with the invisible hand of Adam Smith working through markets. And essentially, what Chandler chronicled was the rise of very sophisticated hierarchical management that ran these big, complicated firms. I think we are living in a dramatically different world today. I think a lot of organizational theorists have almost given up on trying to describe in sort of distilled theoretical terms how organizations are actually managed today, because it is such a complex and sophisticated and subtle enterprise. It's not a boss running the River Rouge plant. It's a kind of collective intelligence, and it's very hard to distill into just a few words or into a simple theoretical model. But somehow, corporations today manage to produce extraordinarily high-tech products in huge quantities with very high reliability, and at the same time accomplish all the social tasks, sometimes grudgingly, that are delegated to them, exercise a lot of influence over government at all levels and sometimes in many different countries, and continuously implement wave after wave of the latest IT technology. This is just an extraordinary management achievement. And so we have in society today these very sophisticated power centers, okay? We call them corporations. They are extraordinarily sophisticated if you look at their management, at the technology they use, at their ability to influence public policy, and all of the social tasks they have been delegated. Now, I just want to just interject one thing quickly here. These aren't entirely or by any means my ideas. If you want to go to the sort of political theory literature, a woman named Susan Strange has written extensively about what she calls structural power. That says that you can have power in a society or in an organization, not by giving orders or setting rules, but by shaping the framework in which other people or other organizations shape the rules. Michel Foucault, the French theorist, came up with the word, and you probably won't want to work this into your ordinary conversation, governmentality. And his idea is if you can shape the systems around people, then you can shape and even control their behavior. And there's a way in which even Karl Marx, back in the old days, said that basically once you release markets into society, you're creating an infrastructure. He thought that infrastructure would dominate the proletariat. They would revolt. You'd move into the socialist era. That hasn't happened. But arguably, there is this amazing new infrastructure orchestrated and controlled by these super powerful companies. So that is sort of the background. Now, where are we today? A couple quick observations, and I'll be glad. I'd love to hear some reactions, criticisms, questions. I haven't really written the last chapter of the little book I'm working on, and I've drafted several different versions of it. The one that I find most plausible is the one that I would call the realist version. And it's a version that's probably going to make the book less likely to get published because publishers these days tend to like books that end hopefully and ideally end with sort of how to do it, how we can make things better. And if I think about the power of citizens in this world of pervasive government influence shaped by corporate influence, I'm not sure how powerful individuals are. I'm not sure whether citizens banding together on environmental causes or go back 150 years on things like child labor can be in an intensely competitive economy where most people don't have a lot of spare time and where a lot of what they read and read and hear and see is shaped by corporations. So I'm not as confident about citizen action now as I think I would like to be. And then, of course, there's government. And if I look at two things, the power of these corporations, which I've just described, and the many ways in which our government, as big as it is, but aside from the Department of Defense, has been weakened and slowed down by procedural activities. And if you look at how so much regulation unfolds today, for the regulators in government to get it right, they've got to collaborate very closely with corporations because the issues they're dealing with in finance, technology, AI, social media, you can go down the list, pollution, all of the know-how and the technology resides with the scientists and engineers in these corporations. So there's a heavy dependence by government on corporations. I'm not sure that's going to change. And if you ask which organizations in society today are more dynamic, more responsive, can move faster, I think again you come back to corporations. Okay. So the traditional ways of restraining the new guardians or restraining power centers in society, citizen action, government action, I think are weak. This puts the responsibilities on the shoulders of the so-called new guardians. And will they restrain themselves in certain ways? Will they pursue responsibility in certain ways? Or will they exercise this power largely in their own interests? I honestly, at this point, am not sure what I'm going to say about that. You can look around and find perhaps some hopeful signs, but you can find some pretty discouraging ones as well. So that's the basic view of this book, that we're in a different society. Corporations are central institutions. They are the new guardians. The old ways of restraining them probably aren't going to work. We have at least a problem, and maybe we've got a challenge of how to restrain them. So let me stop there and see what you all have as questions.
So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I have a
Oh,
question.
sure.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I thank you so much for it. Some of it is sort of in the back of my mind. Is this true? Is it not? But you've certainly developed it, and now it makes sense. I guess so. And as a management, someone from management, I certainly appreciate and understand everything that you're saying. Um, but I also teach in an engineering school. So,
Yes.
what advice do you have for our engineers, our students that are going into these corporations? On the one side, I feel like as you're talking, they have no say. Are they citizen types of actions? Are they going to be part of this corporation that's run by the guardians? Are these guardians engineers? And if so, what's the succession plan? How do they get these engineers starting at, undergraduates that go into industry? Will they ever get to that position, or are they contained within this corporation? There's so many things that I'm thinking about as you're talking about this.
Sure, sure. Well, first, I'm biased by relatives and in-laws of mine. Um, and I think engineers, in all likelihood, are going to become even more influential in corporations if they develop the accompanying management skills. But their technical training will enable them to understand the complex technical problems in organizations and communicate and learn from other technical specialists. And there's so many very deep areas of expertise that have to be brought together for corporations to run. So I think engineers have the foundation to be really influential in corporations if they can also develop the management skills. And that means early in their careers looking for what classically was called P&L responsibility, a little unit you can run, you're accountable for the results. And if the results are good, you get a bigger unit to run. So that would be my basic advice. In terms of where to work, depending on the engineering specialty, a couple of years ago, biomedical engineers were really hot and there were jobs everywhere. And now these jobs have been pretty tough to come by with a slowdown in biotech and then what the Trump administration has been doing with research. So I think the first thing is to find a job that enables you to use your talents and that you're committed to. But I would also look a little further and look a little broader. And that is, what role is this corporation playing in society? And I don't mean just providing goods and services. I mean, what is its impact on society if we look very broadly at how it's relying on IT, technology, social media, uh, what the influence it's trying to exert on governments in the US and elsewhere? You're probably not going to be able to comprehend that. But I would try to take a quick look at it and see if you're kind of comfortable with this corporation as a central social institution and not just a company producing terrific goods and services that you'd like to help them produce. So that off the top of my head, that would be my basic guidance.
Great, thank you. So Elise has a question. What actions can we take as engineers when faced with ethical dilemmas in a stressful company environment?
Well, I would say the key actions actually take place before that moment. When you're faced with the problem, you need to have a network, and probably a small network that includes a couple people that you've got confidence you can speak to them pretty honestly, and they bring not just some experience, but some judgment to the party so that you can go to them. Especially when you're getting started in an organization, sometimes things will look like they're wrong. You just don't understand the whole context, okay? There's other cases where things look like they're wrong. Something is telling you personally they're wrong, and you're probably right. You should trust your instincts, but you ought to check them out too. So my basic advice is try to avoid the prospect of having to be sort of a solitary genius and have some people who are peers, maybe a little ahead of you, that you've gotten to know socially. And you share their interest in work and good work. And you can say, listen, this has come up, just between you and me. what's going on? What do you think's going on? What should I do about it? Ideally, be a mentor who had been around for a while and not your boss telling you to do something that you really don't want to do. Uh, but I'd say really work on those networks. And this is not just a professional network. It's not just a resume building network. It's a network of people, trust, confidence, reliability, good judgment.
Excellent. Thank you. I have another question from an anonymous speaker or person. Drawing from the idea of restraining guardians, how can regulators oversee corporations when they may lack the same level of technical or industry expertise?
Uh, I don't have a good answer to that. Now, of course, every couple of weeks, somebody in a corporation or the whole corporation does something that is illegal, unethical, triggers a media reaction. If you're a regulator, that might be an open door to move quickly and mobilize in the direction of doing something. Okay. Uh, in the ordinary course of work, I think that as a regulator, you've got to develop close relationships with the companies that you're regulating and try to understand not just the immediate regulatory issues, but the broader context in which these companies are working. You, you don't want to be duped by them. You don't want to be uh, persuaded in ways that are subtle and you're not even aware of. But unless you can understand their challenges, their problems, their technology, the difficulties they're facing with your past regulations, you're not going to be able to communicate with them very persuasively. And in a world where so much critical knowledge is in corporations, you got to find a way to get access to that. Now, a lot of people would say, of course, that this is just advice from a business school professor telling regulators to cave into uh, companies. And maybe it would often tend to be that. But given the power, the expertise, the complexity of these technical problems, regulators have to get access to that. Otherwise, I'm not sure what they're doing. They can regulate, and if it gets past, all the regulatory stuff, it'll go to court and it'll get shot down because there'll be a very sophisticated law firm working for the company or the trade association saying this regulation is wrong in the following technical ways and violates the legislation it's supposed to be implementing. So I think that may be the world we're in.
Thank you. Stephanie Michaels asked, is ethical self-regulation a realistic expectation when and the gap of money and power is so rapidly expanding and the common norms and shared values seem to be dwindling so rapidly?
Well, I would say it's not an entirely unrealistic expectation. So you can look at different types of self-regulation and find flaws or just dismaying failures. And not just in corporations, there's medical self-regulation, attorneys self-regulation, all the rest. So, but I like to believe that in a lot of companies, as well as a lot of organizations, there are decent men and women who aren't preoccupied with creating every nickel of shareholder return, who care about some other values that some of them get at or near the top of these organizations and will guide things in the right direction. And so when questions of self-regulation come up, and these are really tough, the regulations require this, but we understand problems that would require a different kind of behavior up here, that they will take steps uh, to address the problem, maybe to work with other companies to address the issue. So there's a level playing field. You don't want to be out there doing it on your own. And maybe to sort of shape some regulations so that when this new activity or problem is regulated, it's done in a sane and sensible way. That's far-sighted, realistic leadership rather than waiting for things to blow up in your face. So I think there's decent ethical people who will try to do things right. And then there's pragmatists who won't want things to blow up and will work with others and try to get a handle on some of these things. So there's some hope. I
Couple of
hope.
questions. Yes. Couple of questions for clarification. One is by Anonymous, is the idea that corporations too powerful to be regulated right now, or that corporations are not able to be regulated towards effective end goals by government?
I see those two as maybe there are subtle distinctions, but I see them as two sides of the same coin.
Mhm.
Uh, these companies are just extraordinarily powerful and adept, and often a couple technology waves ahead of whatever government thinks is the immediate sort of agenda issue. I don't want to caricature things, but I'm sure a lot of people watching have seen bits of video of members of Congress on a committee asking questions of tech people, either the CEOs or the CIOs from the big tech companies. And after like 5 minutes of listening to those questions, and these questions have been written by their staff members, but you get a sense of the extent to which the member of Congress actually understands the question. You want to just go bang your head against the wall because what the companies are doing is so far ahead of what there's any comprehension of. So I think that's maybe a glimpse of the world we're in.
It's interesting. So Kim Wolfenberger says, and I'll come back to that other clarification, but just as you were talking about this, federal and state governments also employ engineers and scientists, as you know. Is there potential for these people to be better or better appreciated advisors to legislature and senior government officials?
Uh, there is, but I think they need to come back to develop what I called a few moments ago, managerial skills. Because I define managerial skills as a wide range of talents. Some are technical and analytical, and some are so-called soft skills that enable you to work with other people and through other people to accomplish a common goal. And that's what you need to do with legislators and their staffs at every level of government. Okay. So this is management, not just in terms of your team or your department, but in terms of broader management skills for enlisting other people in what you're doing. I don't think you want to get out and improvise. I think most companies with a decent size will have a government relations staff or have some attorneys with this experience. And if you find yourself as an engineer involved some technical issue with a legislator or a committee, I'd get some guidance right away. Uh, but it's another managerial skill, basically.
She also adds the organization 314 Action supports engineers and scientists running for office. Would US legislation be better with more technical people in office?
That reminds me of a book I've just sort of finished reading, and it's called Breakneck. It's written by a young guy named Dan Wang who grew up in Canada, worked for a bank in New York, and then has lived in China. And he's Chinese by family ancestry. And he compares China over the last couple decades to America. And he says basically America has an elite dominated by people with legal backgrounds, and they like procedure. They like doing things right. China, he says, is a country that has been basically run by people with strong engineering backgrounds. Okay. And Xi Jinping, the premier, has populated his inner circle with people with engineering backgrounds. And they want to act and build. So I think the world would be a lot better off if we could get the balance differently in this country. Um, you often see, occasionally you see references now to this so-called abundance agenda, which is we need to reshape our politics and our economy to just build more things so we have more stuff for people, like houses, okay, that they can afford to live in. And That's this sort of Chinese engineering build it mentality. So I've got a pretty strong bias in that direction.
Thank you so much. So going back to that question of clarification, how are you defining social institutions and whether or what other social institutions corporations are now replacing?
Um, Good question. I mean, obviously, there are other social institutions like churches, families, some local communities, although some of these have been weakened by sort of modernizing trends in society where people are very busy and they move around a lot. It's encapsulated in a book that maybe 25 years ago called Bowling Alone. The idea is a lot of social fabric have been worn away. Instead of people going bowling with a group every week, they go and bowl by themselves every month. So there are these other social institutions. Marx sort of predicted that capitalism and markets would sort of wear them away, and he may well have been right about that. Um, I think these corporations are actually a new kind of institution because there has been nothing like pervasive IT, the so-called noosphere, ever before. If Ford Motor wanted to run ads for the Model T or the Model A coming out of the River Rouge plant, it did ads on the radio and then later, television. But these advertisements are everywhere. And with AI, they are going to be customized to you personally. To some extent, they are already. And that is part of our social life. You can go to a dating app, okay? You can go to a music app. You go to the New York Times. Everywhere there's data is being gathered. You're leaving this so-called trail of digital exhaust. It's being examined, and then it's being analyzed, and then it's being used to sort of nudge you in different directions. It's throughout our lives. That I think is a wholly new sort of social institution. Maybe, in the book 1984 by George L. Orwell, Big Brother sort of anticipated that. Uh, I think this is fundamentally new. And it's what also makes it new is the corporations are at the center of it. There have been governments that tried to be totalitarian, i.e., to control the total experience of society and the total political life of society. But to have corporations at the center of this, I think that's a new phenomenon.
This is really interesting. This kind of reminds me of when I was teaching a marketing class. And we used to talk about the institutions that are around us that shape who we are.
Yeah.
There were religious institution, educational institution, family institution, and then there was on the side of this sort of triangle was the media. And it almost sounds like that media has expanded to the point that they've had to market, and as they're marketing, they're using IT, and now it's no longer this sort of triangle, but a square that has this technology part that has become an institution that's taking over. Is that what you're suggesting? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, and I think we're just beginning to really understand
Mm.
what it does now, and
Mm.
we ought to do some thinking about what it will do soon with AI. I
Yeah.
agree completely.
I hear you. Okay. So the anonymous also asks a question, and I don't know whether this is the same anonymous, but here it goes. How will this new order, well, actually, no, let me find the other question that I thought, kind of leads into this. Here we go. Yes, this is it. How will then this new world order of business interests taking over historical government activities handle the inherently governmental task of things like social services and public health if these are overseen by corporations that must produce profit? Are we doomed?
Well, first of all, there will be some corporations that want to provide the IT infrastructure for providing social services for government payments of various kinds, Social Security. It might be done a little bit more efficiently. Okay. I think that's a side observation, but it's likely to be true. The public health one is very tricky. First of all, right now we're seeing the evisceration of a lot of important health public health institutions. So we have to hope that pharma companies, biotech companies will step in and fill that gap, doing the research, developing the products, making sure that they're safe. We also should go back to COVID, and that was the large public health crisis of the last, well, you pick your number, decade, century, whatever, okay? And that was essentially solved by government initially saying that we will indemnify you against losses and you can build these plants as fast as possible. Don't worry about what it's going to cost. But big pharma invented, produced, and there was something like 4 billion COVID doses that were, or COVID vaccine doses in a year or so, saving in all likelihood, tens of millions of lives. So that's not a bad world if we can get big companies with all these sophisticated management skills and the technology mobilized in the right way. Uh, in fact, that I think is what a good deal of our public health depends on, for well and ill.
One last question, and I'm not sure if, how much time we have, but I definitely want you to start with the second part of this.
Okay, yeah, I'd
Question
like
is,
to have a couple minutes at least, yeah.
all right, so if corporations have become these sorts of reality machines that distort the perspective of their users and society at large, who decides the truth of a situation? What are the ramifications of these subjective realities in echo chambers?
Oh, really good question. Was that in another anonymous question?
Yes, it was.
These people should shed their anonymity. They're asking good questions.
Right.
Uh, I honestly don't know. Uh, I think at a personal level, each of us has to sort of find some ways to immunize ourselves, sort of vaccinate ourselves against these pervasive influencers and invaders in our lives. And I don't know exactly how to do that. And I love technology, and I probably spend too much time on devices and learning about it. It's fascinating, but you've got to preserve a little sphere of your own, uh, where you try to sort of think for yourself and sense your feelings and respond to them and hope that these aren't unduly influenced by this ubiquitous stuff all around us. I mean, this morning I was reading the New York Times online, and I clicked on one ad, and because I couldn't tell what was being advertised, okay? And I wanted to see what it was. And then this thing popped up and said I could either accept all the cookies or manage the cookies. And I didn't want to waste any time on either one. So that was the end of it. That same ad popped up four more times as I scrolled down through the first page of the New York Times feed. 5 more times. Uh, I don't know how many more times I'm going to see it today when I'm online. So
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for patiently answering these questions
Oh,
and
sure,
so
sure.
thorough. We have about 10 minutes, so if you want
Yes.
to, we can
All right.
continue with your presentation.
Yeah, let me just put the basic ideas in front of you because this is something that I think you can sort of think about in personal terms and test the ideas. So uh, this is drawing on a paper that was published in a publication called Society just about a month or so ago. The title is let me see, let me get it here so I make sure I get it right. Because we went back and forth on this title. Uh, Starts with The Enigma of Human Moral Intelligence. So the little story I will start with is Geoffrey Hinton, who was a young psychologist in the 1980s. And he wanted to learn how the human mind worked. And so he said, what I'm going to do is put together a very simple, like primitive computer model of a human mind, and let's see what we can learn from that. And all of his advisors told him that this was going to be the end of his academic career. and he pursued it. And what he ended up doing was developing a lot of the fundamental tools that are now used in AI. And he won the Nobel Prize for physics. There's no Nobel Prize for AI. So physics was the place, I guess, they could sort of stick it into in 2024. So he's viewed as the godfather of AI. And the question I asked and just toyed with, okay, just kind of for fun, was what if we did the same thing now and said, what can we learn about how we think if we look at AI programs? And in particular, what can we learn about how we think about moral issues, moral decisions we have to make if we think about AI programs? And what's interesting about that is that no one really knows how AI programs make the decisions they make. Okay? You'll hear that statement from people who run, I don't have the quote in front of me, but the CEO of Anthropic, the you know the company that has Claude. Um, uh, all they know is that these zillions of neurons or electronic neurons are connected, and at blinding speed, electricity moves through them, and then some words come up on the screen. Okay. And now, if you go to some of the deep research AI programs, you'll see what's called chain of thought. And it'll say, well, I'm analyzing this, and then I analyze this, and here it is, and this is what I found, and all the rest. But you have no idea how the neural network produced that, okay? So the question I've asked in this little paper is, what if our minds essentially work the same way, okay? And we like to think that when we make a decision, we can explain the decision. Okay, I did this, and this was the main data I looked at, or this was the logic I followed, and all the rest. And we can do that, and we do that. And if you're in a position of responsibility and you're making a hard decision, you have to do something like that, and then explain why you made the decision to everybody else, and explain it pervasively. But do we really know how our minds make these final decisions? I'm not talking about the easy, obvious ones. Something is illegal, don't do it, okay? The gray area ones. And when I've spent a lot of time studying gray areas, and one remarkable defining characteristic of gray areas is that you can have the same people who know each other and respect each other and trust each other looking at the same situation and the same data and reaching different conclusions about what's right or what's important or what we should do. And you can find this in management teams and lots of other places where a group has to make a hard decision. I think almost everybody knows this from their own experience in families when these decisions have to be made. And you can ask people, well, why do you come down where you come down? And they can explain down a couple levels. But at some point, it's just sort of how they see things. And how they see things comes out of this gray matter, as we call it, this organic material in our minds. And if you look at neuroscientists, and I've only done this in an amateur way, and you say, how much do we really understand about our brains? The answer right now is almost nothing. We know that certain activities take place in certain parts. Some are connected to others. The human brain has been described as the most complex entity in the universe. Somehow it's a physical entity, and yet consciousness comes out of this. No one has any idea of how that happens. So basically, the proposition in the first part of this article is that we don't understand how AI programs, quote, think. And at these deeper levels, we don't know how we really think, and why I come up with a different view of what's really important, what we ought to do in a situation from somebody else I know and trust and I've worked with, okay, or might have a family relationship with or something. So I asked them, what are sort of the implications of this? And it moves me in the direction of what's called pragmatist philosophy. And for those of you who aren't familiar, by pragmatism, I don't mean sort of just do whatever works, whatever's going to make money, whatever's going to make you feel good. I mean the distinctively American philosophical school of pragmatism that was developed in the Boston area by a number of people, most prominently, I think, William James, brilliant psychologist more than 100 years ago. And he wrote in very clear language about what pragmatism was. And his view is that when you face a tough problem, you ought to think about it in very modest terms because there may be a great deal that you just don't know about the problems. When you're facing with a really tough problem, try to think about everything you can that's related to the problem. Think capaciously. A famous statement of William James is, facts are good. Give me plenty of facts. Principles are indubitably good. Give me plenty of principles. In other words, don't look at something in one way. Don't indulge your initial intuition about what's right and wrong. Look as broadly as you possibly can. Then look for a good enough reason, not a perfect reason. You're not going to find a perfect reason because you're not going to understand why your brain has given you whatever you think the sort of final decision is. Do this with other people, okay? Learn as best you can from other people. Make provisional commitments. Don't make big commitments unless you actually have to. Make a provisional one and see what you learn by action. The pragmatists were really cared about experience and learning from experience, not what you learn by sort of sitting in sort of isolation. And be ready to adapt and change. This is, by the way, I think the sort of implicit moral philosophy that a lot of business managers follow. And I think in a world where we really don't understand how we decide things, the sort of William James pragmatist philosophy is the right one. The big question, of course, and I'll close with this, is okay, that's all fine. Think capaciously, talk with other people, lots of principles. That's great. How do you make the final decision? And my answer to that is make a decision. Just decide, okay? Decide. You may want to sleep on it, see if you still like it the next day. But if it's a decision that you think is sound, you can explain persuasively, you can live with as a professional, as a person, it may not be right. And your brain might have processed the data differently 2 days ago, 3 weeks ago, after a different meal, who knows? Make a decision, move ahead, hope you get more of them right than others. But don't think that if you think forever, read forever, study forever, you'll come up with some final principle that's going to tell you what to do. We don't really know how we make these decisions. So it's kind of a provocative perspective, but some of you may want to think about it a little bit. I can't. You're mute.
Thank you so
There you
much.
go.
I was just thanking you. I apologize.
Oh.
I was muted. Anonymous says, this has been a great talk. How can we get in touch with Professor Badaracco to follow up on some of these insights? I think
Sure.
Dr. Badaracco told you at the beginning that he needs to know who you are for. But
Yeah,
thank you. I
well, you could
really
use,
appreciate.
yeah.
Thank you. We really appreciate you sharing this time
My
with us.
email is easy to find if you go to Harvard University site. So just put in my last name and send me an email.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again for
Welcome.
sharing your time
Good.
and
I
your
enjoyed it.
insights with us. We're looking forward to your next book. I also want to thank
Me
all of
too.
the audience members that are here today. And of course, Rosalind Byrne, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, who's the director of this program, along with Professor Guian, who's also here joining us. So thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And most importantly, our coordinator, Tracy Marshalls, without whom we wouldn't be able to do these. So thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic Friday, and we hope to see you again. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Badaracco.
So are we among ourselves now?
Not quite. quite, because if I do, I end the webinar completely. And it seems like there's 24 participants still here. But anyway, I would like to thank you for coming on today.
You're welcome. Thank you for doing everything. I should move on to lunch now, but thank you
Yes.
very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Nice to meet you, Tracy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.